Good evening and welcome to the IISS. I'm Virginia Comolli. Over there is my colleague Antonio Sampaio. We are the Security and Development Program. We are particularly excited to be hosting this event tonight and to introduce our new stream of research on urban security. This is a theme that is going to guide our work going forward, so we really need your input in this early stage. When the Security and Development Program was established in 2014, our main focus was on hybrid forms of insecurity in developing regions. And within this framework, we ran a number of initiatives and projects on different countries and on different sub-themes. But having had the chance to scan the relevant literature and to also assess the state of the policy debate, we concluded last year that it was time to refocus or narrow our focus onto urban security. And by doing this, we would find ourselves in a stronger position to provide an innovative contribution to a field of research that is still relatively nascent. As the name of our program entails, Security and Development, through our efforts, we aim to bring together a range of perspectives that include security, defense, foreign affairs, which are at the core traditionally of what IISS does, together with development, economic and business perspectives and humanitarian considerations. And we want to do that going forward with our urban portfolio. Before we get into the details of our planned work, let me take you through some of the demographic and urbanization trends that underpin our thinking. For thousands of years, the population has grown very slowly. But in recent centuries, the pace has increased dramatically. Think that between 1900 and 2000, the increase in the world's population was 3 times greater than in the entire previous history of humanity. So basically, population went from 1.5 billion in 1900 to 6.1 billion within 100 years. According to United Nations projections, this rapid urban growth is likely, this rapid population growth is likely to continue. From the 7.3 billion people who are on the globe, on this planet today, population is going to grow by over 30% by the mid of this century, and by over 50% by the beginning of the next century, bringing the total population to 11.2 billion. But growth is not evenly distributed across the globe. This trend is more evident in certain regions. The highest growth rate is registered in Africa, which is also the continent with the youngest population. Notably, between 2015 and 2050, half of the world's population growth is expected to be concentrated in 9 countries, which, with the exception of the United States, are either going to be in Africa or Asia. Changes have also occurred with respect to where people live. In the 1950s, over 2/3 of the population lived in rural settlements. But things look very different now. Take a look at this graph here. The red line indicates people living in urban environments, while the green line indicates people living in the countryside. 2008 was a milestone in the history of humankind. This was the first time ever that there were more people living in cities than there were in the countryside. And today, approximately 55% of the population lives in cities. And as you can see from this graph, projections indicate that this trend is likely to continue. More and more people will converge towards urban environments, while the number of people living in rural environments has plateaued and likely to remain more or less the same for the foreseeable future. Projections also indicate that more and more people will live in large cities with over 1 million inhabitants, and megacities with 10 million inhabitants or more. Specifically, of the 8.5 billion people expected to live on this planet in 2030, 60% of the population will be in urban areas, and 1 in 3 people will either reside in a large or a megacity. But if we look even further into the future, we can expect an extra 2.5 billion urban dwellers by 2050. And once again, these global trends are all interesting, but to make them very useful, actually, we need to break this data down and look at regional dynamics, because if we do that, we'll find out that India, China, and Nigeria will make up alone over 30% of those additional urban residents. And if we add to those three nations urban dwellers from DRC, Ethiopia, Tanzania, Bangladesh, Indonesia, Pakistan, and the US, what we'll have is that 54% of the new urban population in the world in 2050 will be distributed in 10 countries alone. This uneven distribution also pertains to megacities, i.e. those cities with over 10 million inhabitants. Take a look at this map. At the moment, as of 2016, there were 31 megacities in the world. Of those 31 megacities, 26 are located in less developed regions of the so-called global south. And in fact, you can see those cluster of bubbles, especially in Asia and Latin America. But if you look at the future, we can see that by 2030, 10 new megacities are expected to, or 10 cities are expected to graduate to the level of megacities. And of those new megacities, none is in North America or in Europe. They're all across the global south. So you can see Bogotá in Colombia, Luanda in Angola, Lahore in Pakistan, and so on and so forth. So population growth and urbanization, of course, bring opportunities, but also challenges. Countries in the global south have been driving and are likely to continue to drive global population growth. More and more people from Africa, Asia, and parts of Latin America will increasingly converge towards urban centers. Africa, for instance, is expected to account for more than half of the population growth between now and 2050. To put things into perspective, according to the United Nations, by 2050, there will be more Nigerians than Americans. But this is not just a matter of magnitude. Of course, these figures I've been telling you about are quite staggering on their own. But it's actually the pace with which these trends are developing that is a key factor in our thinking and in some of the challenges that we want to study going forward. I'll give you the example of Johannesburg in South Africa, which is one of the cities expected to become a megacity by 2030. Here there are two maps highlighting Johannesburg urban growth between 1990 and 2013. The purple areas indicate the urban build-up. The yellow areas surrounding the purple, those are urbanized or fringe open spaces. And the green is rural open space. And we think it's quite staggering that in a fairly brief period of time, 23 years, between 1990 and 2013, the population grew by 154%. Of course, this is a very staggering example of Johannesburg, but these trends are quite common across a number of large cities in the global south. And among the challenges they've been referring to early is the inability often by local communities to meet, or local authorities, to meet the needs of these new urban dwellers who arrive in the cities in large numbers at a high pace and are in need of services, jobs, are in need of security. The result is exemplified by this rather sad slide over here, because the result is that in low-income countries, as well in fragile and conflict-affected situations, over 60% of the population end up living in slums, in areas where government has little presence, where informal forms of governance are developed, and where grey or illicit economies become the norm, and of course, where non-state armed groups often thrive. And these are indeed the areas that we hope we are going to study as part of our new research portfolio.
So one of the consequences of these governance and development challenges is what UN Habitat calls a global wave of peripherization. sprawling areas or slums with informal land arrangements, often marginalized and insecure. The world's slum population is already at 863 million, and according to the World Bank, it's forecast to grow by 500 million inhabitants by 2020. Urbanization, again, as Virginia mentioned, leads to economic and social benefits in many cases. But what we are seeing with increasing frequency is the combination of organized crime and armed violence, leading to what some researchers call endemic urban violence. Again, UN Habitat, in a study from 2014, warned about autonomous and no-go areas, such as slums and other informal settlements, that effectively lie outside local and central government control. You have probably heard the gloomy predictions about how urbanization is inevitably leading to increased conflict. Whereas part of that, those predictions might be overblown. This growing sense of concern is linked to, according to different sources, to increased demographic pressures on urban systems combined with the attractiveness of these areas to non-state armed groups. For instance, the concept of hybrid war was widely discussed during the conflict in eastern Ukraine starting in 2014, consisting of a combination of tactics used simultaneously by states and a variety of non-state actors, primarily in cities. And you see here the destroyed Donetsk International Airport. This linkage between urbanization and non-state armed activity is further strengthened by some of the illicit or gray economies that have become associated with globalization. So in defining deviant globalization, the US National Defense University mentioned cities as part of an archipelago of transnational illicit flows that runs from cities in the US to the slums of Rio, to the banlieue of Paris, to an almost continuous urban slum that girds the Gulf of Guinea. In addition, insurgencies and other types of non-state conflict in rural or border areas end up spilling over into cities and exporting to them weapons, armed groups, political tensions, and criminal economies. A 2004 study on the effects of neighboring conflicts on Kabul in Afghanistan and Karachi in Pakistan concludes that the classic rural warlord seems to morph gradually into a modern urban one. Our point here is not to argue that urbanization is causing conflict, but we do note the increased concern that rapid and unmanaged urban population growth and the policy pressures that accompany it are interacting with and adding to risk factors associated to fragility and conflict. Thinking on how to move from this broader picture of urban vulnerability and conflict towards a more concrete unit of analysis, we have been focusing on the issue of disputed territories. These are unstable peripheries in which these challenges of governance and non-state armed activity usually come together. Disputed territories is for us a concept that captures a set of converging social and strategic challenges, such as demographics, governance, and non-state armed groups. They are converging because of some of the trends that Virginia pointed out, not just population growth, but the added risks that come from unmanaged urbanization, such as rising demand for services and an advantageous environment for non-state armed groups. This is usually coupled with existing sources of fragility, such as recent or nearby armed conflicts, poverty, and criminal economies. Just think of the variety of terms that we have heard associated with these areas: ganglands, no-go areas, criminal enclaves. These concepts have often been used without much discipline, but they attempt to convey this growing concern with specific areas within specific cities. This is something that our research project is currently thinking about. It is not megacities that are the problem, but the transformation of specific urban peripheries into contested areas. This is not as simple as pointing to a slum in Cape Town and saying it is a gangland, or a specific area in Karachi and saying it is a no-go area. It is about understanding that there is a common set of policy dilemmas involved in devising state strategy towards those areas. And related to that, it is also about beginning to understand the utility of force in changing the outlook in these areas. And this is where we want to understand the linkage between urban studies and strategic studies. As I mentioned, the challenge is not about just gunfights. It is about presence, intimidation, and rough governance by non-state groups. So far, the security thinking around cities has been a pretty grim area of research. Some of the seminal articles in this field have carried titles such as Pharaoh Cities, The New Middle Ages, and Cities Without Joy. The field of strategic studies among both academia and military practitioners has been so far focused on urban warfare as an all-out struggle in densely built-up areas, and for that reason, a difficult and unforgiving environment. This understanding of urban environments as battlefields has also resulted in silos when trying to think about urban security policies. Urbanist development practitioners and international organizations such as UN Habitat have been left with a reduced policy toolbox. Frameworks such as prevention, gang rehabilitation, and community policing frequently crumble in face of highly organized violence in unstable peripheries. Thinking strategically about security in cities means thinking beyond urban warfare. It means thinking about how the changing character of conflict affects cities. General Charles Krulak expressed in 1909 a highly influential concept, the three-block war. State forces in these unstable peripheries will have to combat non-state foes in one block, conduct peacekeeping in the next block, and deliver humanitarian aid in the next one. All in the space, of course, of 3 blocks. This is a metaphor, of course, but it expresses the sense of urban conflict having moved beyond something like warfare towards something even more complicated, something hybrid, protracted, and centered around non-state actors, challenging our existing response mechanisms. What we have observed lately is that these complex conflict dynamics become clear and concrete challenges in key areas, which we are calling disputed territories. They are pockets of high-intensity armed activity located in large metropolitan areas of the global south. And they look more or less like this. This is not our map. This is a map done by a Karachi newspaper called the Express Tribune in an article entitled "Where Law Enforcers Fear to Tread, the Entry Fee May Be Your Life." So the areas in orange represent the areas that are no-go areas just for one specific ethnic group, and the red ones that are complete no-go areas for outsiders because of the presence of political militias, militants linked to border insurgents, and criminal gangs. A similar blur of insurgents, paramilitary militias, and gangs was a feature in Medellin, a city that was at the center of armed conflict in Colombia, having received flows of people fleeing guerrilla warfare in nearby rural areas. Conflict and non-state armed presence was overwhelmingly concentrated in key unstable slums, such as Comuna 13. The comunas are hillside communities impoverished, often described as slums. So despite concentrating just over 5% of the population, it had, as the newspaper article shows, as the picture shows, 3 guerrilla groups present there at the same time. This article is from 2002. So the CAP is a group that no longer exists, the FARC and the National Liberation Army. Also in 2002, it concentrated close to 40% of the people who fled their homes in Medellin. 38% of them, of the total amount of people that fled Medellin, were based in Comuna 13. And to this day, Comuna 13 concentrates a significant proportion of the violence measured both in terms of homicides and the sheer presence of criminal groups which inherited the non-state governance over these areas. And one final example of what disputed territories look like. A city that learned from Medellin in order to implement its security policies. Brazil, of course, doesn't face armed conflict. However, key slums inside the city are controlled by armed groups. Not only do they control these territories, but they often invade each other's territories, they expand their territories, and they use those territories as basis for their shadow economies. And this is the map of the authorities' attempt to intervene and reverse this territorial control through approximately 30 pacification bases manned by highly armed military police officers and accompanied by peace building, development, and services, some of them as basic as rubbish collection and mail delivery, which were previously unavailable. So these are some very specific examples of the policy challenges facing local and national authorities of the Global South, despite the diversity of local contexts. And Virginia now will show you how we're thinking about these issues within specific projects.
Yeah. Well, so city drives countries' GDP, and more often than not, they are home to the bulk of the population. So their crucial role cannot be overestimated. So Karachi, to mention one, is home to 12% of the population of Pakistan, and alone it generates over 50% of the country's tax revenue. Therefore, in our work, we want to highlight the conflict within such urban settings demands tailored policy tools. But here is the dilemma. How do we find the correct calibration of security and development tools in densely inhabited but also disputed urban areas? So in order to answer those questions, we are embarking on 2 projects which we hope will pave the way for other activities that we already actually have on the pipeline. So the first project is very much concentrated on disputed urban territories. And Antonio has already introduced the concept of disputed territories and the growing concern among security and defense circles regarding the new challenges posed by rapid urban growth in regions that are also facing high levels of armed violence. So in our study, we'll explore dynamics of territorial control by non-state armed groups in disputed territories. We'll investigate how their control, or the way they control territory has changed, how their actions impact broader security dynamics, and also how they react to or adapt to policy responses or law enforcement, military responses, peace building, development efforts, depending on the region or the city that we are talking about. But we don't want to limit ourselves to just studying what the non-state armed groups and the gangs are doing. We actually want to look at the other side of the coin. We want to assess how current policy responses are being developed and implemented in disputed territories, really emphasizing the multidimensional character of security thinking towards city that has been developed or been developing over the past few years. And so in doing so, we'll consider security, development, and urbanistic responses in cities, as well as the role of the private sector when relevant. So the initial cities that we have selected for our studies are Karachi, which we are going to visit in a couple of weeks. That will be our first piece of field research. We'll also be doing studies in Rio de Janeiro, Cape Town, and Beirut. So we will try to identify commonalities between the ways, among the ways that the various non-state armed groups exert control over territories, but also in the ways that local authorities are responding to those challenges. Of course, we realize that these are very different, very diverse cities, and different dynamics will be more prominent in one or the other. So this won't be a comparative studies in the more traditional sense, because we are very, very mindful of the city or country-specific dynamics. But we selected on purpose cities from different regions so that we can build a framework that encompasses all these different dynamics. In some cities, the challenge will be primarily of a criminal nature. Somewhere else, it will be to do with violent jihadist extremism. Elsewhere, we will see the impact of large migration and refugee flows. And we aim to produce a report on this in early 2018. The second project that we are about to start is an 18-month initiative focused on Colombia and urban transition in the post-conflict era. As you might be aware, last year the government of Colombia and the FARC guerrilla signed a peace agreement, so the conflict is formally over. However, across many Colombian municipalities, the authorities have registered an increase in the presence and activities of criminal groups. And indeed, one of the risks associated with the FARC guerrilla demobilizing is actually the splintering of the group. We have already seen some of this. And the risk that these offshoots will actually become more entrenched in criminal activities. And I'd like to emphasize more because actually the FARC has already been involved in criminal activities, particularly drug trafficking. And urban environments offer an ideal operational ground for these groups because they offer opportunities for extortion, trafficking, kidnapping. And with some 7,000 FARC fighters who are about to demobilize. And actually, if we consider the various militia and support networks around the FARC, we are looking at some 40,000 people who are now demobilizing or in the process of being demobilized, who might actually turn to criminality. So as we have discussed, violence and organized crime in urban centers are crucial risk factors for economic and social prosperities, as cities are also so important for the economic growth of a country. And the poorest of the people tend to be highly concentrated in informal urban settlements and peripheries, and are indeed particularly vulnerable to the various forms of violence that we have discussed today. Of course, these are common features across a number of Latin American countries, but so you might wonder why Colombia? And there are two main reasons. One is that urban-based activities such as services and constructions have become more important in view of declining commodity revenues in Colombia. And also because Colombia is still urbanizing. As you might remember from my earlier slide, the capital, Bogotá, is expected to become one of the mega cities by 2030. So ensuring urban security is not only a public good in itself, but is a crucial stepping stone towards achieving sustainable economic growth and social development, which are two crucial parts of Colombia's post-conflict challenge. So as part of this project, we plan to engage extensively with local authorities. In fact, the aim of the whole initiative is to produce and deliver a training handbook on how, for key stakeholders, such as police, intelligence, health services, critical infrastructures, and also some private sector actors, how they are affected by all this, by this changing security environment, and also how they can adapt to this new environment. So we see these two projects that I've briefly discussed as really just the initial stepping stones in a broader program of activities on urban security that we hope will grow and develop quite organically, building on this initial phase. So as such, we are very open to your feedback and suggestions at this stage. Either tonight, there will be time for from feedback and questions right now, or perhaps at a later stage if you want to get in touch with us. That's our email address, security-development@iiss.org. We look forward to your feedback and also to your comments if you had any right now. Thank you.
Really, really interesting stuff, and congratulations to IISS to tackle this particular issue a little bit outside of strategic studies. One comment, and perhaps a sort of critical investigation. You seem to tie this mostly to the growth of them, so it seems to be a quantitative issue. These will be mega cities, there will be quote-unquote too many people living there, which will create all sorts of issues. That's nice and fine and very plausible, and the numbers you showed were dramatic, but a city as such, an urban center as such, is also a qualitatively different way of life. So I wonder if you could expand a little bit on what that actually means and how that factors in. By way of critique, you place all the case studies and what you mostly talked about in the global south. Again, plausible. But cities are not just places, spaces. They're also nodes, sites of circulation. And most of the cities you mentioned are in some form or another tied into, well, a global urban network. They have connections, be it financial, be it cultural, be it personal, be it whatever it is, with other cities, not least with significant cities in the global north. That doesn't seem to be factoring in. But even in development studies, we now know that whatever goes on in the global south somehow has to be accounted for in terms of its relationships with the global north. So where are the cities in the north? Apologies, Andreas Benke, Reading.
No, I think those are very valid points. Thank you, and they allow us to expand on some of our thinking. We started the presentation with the facts and the data, but actually our approach is more, well, it is actually qualitative as opposed to quantitative. And I agree, the figures are staggering, but you have to actually understand what they mean. And for instance, there are lots of people out there who write a lot about the mega cities, but actually one of the arguments that we made, okay, the mega cities are important and it's interesting to see how more there will be, but actually being a mega city doesn't automatically translate into being a problematic city. And indeed, more people will actually live in large cities as opposed to the mega cities. So we are very much aware of that, and we shouldn't just jump on some kind of sexy headlines about the mega cities. So we totally take your point. And actually, looking at the specific city case studies allow us to understand better the actual dynamics. So not just looking at the cold numbers, but actually looking at social dynamics and economic dynamics beyond the numbers. With regard to the global south and the fact that we are not including developed regions, well, the remit of our program, Security and Development Program, is to focus on developing regions. So that's, I know, okay, that's one poor excuse. I take that. We haven't really thought about the linkages, but it's great to have this input at this early phase, so we can factor that in. Antonio,
yeah, I think that this issue of the linkage is something that I explored informally with some academic partners in Latin America. For instance, we want to do a research project on, this is just in the realm of ideas, on the cities of the South Atlantic. The South Atlantic has a lot of cities in West Africa and South America that have this sort of organized crime problem, and plus, militias and gangs. And we want to, study how the drug flows or other illicit weapons, illicit flows affect each other's security and development. However, it's an area that I don't think has been very well developed in the literature, and in order to carry that out, we'll need further funding. So it's an area that we are interested. It's perhaps a step ahead of what we're doing now.
Yeah, good evening. Many thanks for your very interesting presentation. My name is Morten Olsen. I'm a postgraduate student at King's College in the War Studies department. And I'd be interested to to what extent do you look into the power relation between the cities and their host nations? And to what extent the relationship about the authority in addressing these security issues is taken into consideration? Thank you.
Yeah.
That's very interesting. Well, it is often a very complex and fragmented picture because usually security in terms of crime is the domain of state or provincial governments, whereas national security in terms of insurgency, terrorism is usually the domain of national governments, and with the added caveat that it's all implemented in the local arena, and municipal authorities have a lot of input and the practicalities of the thing. The answer to that in practical terms is that we're trying to, in this field research that we're doing, to talk with as wide as possible array of policymakers and stakeholders. We're also, of course, talking to local experts, that can provide a kind of cross-cutting view of what's happening. And aside from that, I think this point is a point that can be expanded further, again, through further research, through a policy document, because it's an area that we ourselves have been thinking to explore in Africa, in Sub-Saharan Africa, where there have been a number of initiatives to try to bring security more towards the local authorities. And of course, we're very much aware of the discussion about global cities, about cities as being the mayors rule the world argument, that cities and local authorities are much more effective and proactive and free to explore innovative policies than national governments that are usually slow and big and chunky. So I think this is a further area of research. It's not at the center of our project right now, but it's something that is very interesting and is a growing trend.
Good evening. My name is Marcus Kaiser from the International Committee of the Red Cross. First of all, really great that you're doing this. Yes, I think I may also announce here that the ICRC and IISS, with a little bit of luck, we are actually going to have a joint conference on aspects of this particular issue in Geneva sometime this year. So it's something that we really think is very timely. Yes, maybe two questions. Yes, are you also going to look? And again, I look at myself representing the ICRC. Are you going to look at how organizations, take the ICRC, let's say development and aid organizations, have managed to transform itself in the response to those security challenges in the urban century? Are you going to look at that? That's the first question. And then maybe just a suggestion. If you think of post-conflict cities, would you consider a city not too far away from here, actually in this country, a little bit further north, in Belfast, as a valid example of a post-conflict city? Those who have traveled to Belfast, I'm one of those, we are always staggered by yes, there's a latent conflictual potential there, yes. There are actually more walls. Everybody talks about walls these days. There are more walls in Belfast than in the mid-90s, after 96, a Good Friday Agreement. Yes, from a purely theoretical perspective, would you consider Belfast as being a potential candidate for your study on post-conflict cities at one moment?
Yeah, I guess starting with this second question, Marcus, thank you. I think we have discussed Belfast as an example, and as you probably put it, would fall under the realm of the more theoretical work, I would say background research. I don't think at this stage we would actually carry out a fully fledged case study on Belfast and trying to focus on the global south just for now in this phase. With regard to looking at how international organization, development and aid actors are responding, I think in our study of responses we are trying to be as comprehensive as possible. So we want to study how law enforcement and the military are responding to some challenges in cities, but we also want to see what the development actors are doing and what how the urban planners are dealing with the challenges and so on and so forth. So the international organization will fall within that spectrum of responses that we want to look at, because we are firm believers that in order to reach or to obtain sustainable, I think I should highlight sustainable security and stability and growth, you need a multi-pronged approach. And so you cannot do it without looking at development or aid actors as well.
Yes, and to add to that, I think unfortunately, we cannot go beyond what is actually happening right now, because I have to commend the ICRC and the broader humanitarian community for thinking very actively about what it means to operate in cities. There are a number of initiatives, including the Global Alliance for Urban Crisis that was launched last year in the World Humanitarian Summit, the new urban agenda that was launched last October by the UN. For those who don't know, it's a very influential, very important document that is launched every 20 years in the global summit called Habitat. Last year was Habitat 3, and this new urban agenda is supposed to guide urbanization strategies or approaches during the next 20 years. And ICRC was successfully a voice pushing for thinking about how cities affected or recently affected by conflict can be improved through this thinking on the global urbanization trends. So the humanitarian field has done a lot of that, but as I began to show in my presentation, we think that the armed forces, in terms of their strategic thinking, have not really come to terms with the broader trends of urbanization. And in fact, this will feature in a coming issue of the ICRC review, War in Cities, in which this discussion will feature. So tactically and technically, they have, of course, thought about military operations in urban environment for a long time, but strategically about how it means to operate with these protracted, lower intensity forms of armed violence that sometimes fall slightly below the threshold of armed conflict. They haven't adapted that well or that explicitly. So we would love to be able to look into a specific, major representative organization, let's say NATO, and see how it has adapted to an urban environment, but they themselves have not been thinking about that. So what we're doing instead is studying how different actors are improvising their initiatives and adapting on the go, which was what happened in Latin America, in many cases, Latin America, because it is the most urbanized among the developing regions. So it combines the security and criminal problems of developing regions with the levels of urbanization that you only see in developed regions. So yeah, that's a long way of saying it is an important issue that we want to look at.
Yeah, and also just to go back to the development angle and development actors, the fact that the Sustainable Development Agenda that was adopted in September 2015, it actually has a goal, Goal 11, on cities, which aims to ensure that cities are safe, inclusive, and resilient. That's, I guess, in a way, is a further sign that we must indeed look at the development angle as part of our work. Sorry. Next one.
I was just wondering, obviously the study's going to look, Alistair Carnes, MOD, the study's obviously going to look into law enforcement. I was wondering if it's going to look into how governments and cities illegitimately enforce the law through the use of proxies, pseudo-gang warfare, or how it using forces that don't necessarily fall into line with our views of democratic, moral, and ethical outlines to keep and maintain the peace.
Yeah, that is not going to win us many friends. However, we are going to look into that. And as I anticipated earlier, for instance, we are going to Karachi soon. And that what you described is very much pertinent to the issue, to the situation in Karachi, where there is one of the main parties is actually itself involved in criminal activities, and it's very common for political actor to use militias to repress their oppositions and whoever has a different view. So we want definitely to include that, absolutely.
Yeah, and I think a crucial issue that is actually the policy, perhaps is the most urgent policy question that drove our initial interest long before we thought about launching a more formal project on that, is the utility of force in cities. Because again, through the initial scoping exercises that we've done, we began to see that improvisation is very much the law of the cities when it comes to security. Not thinking in this multidimensional way and thinking silos. So this is something that is very highlighted, very widely highlighted in studies from strategic studies from the security field, that we don't really negotiate, we don't really talk to urbanists, urban planners, urban development, urban services. We don't take them into account. We think tactically, which is perfectly fine for the point of view of warfare. But so we want to understand if some form of force can or cannot have a role in changing the outlook of these low-intensity protracted conflicts alongside and probably on the backseat of policies that are aimed at longer-term stabilization in these areas.
The second row.
Adrian Carderoy from LexisNexis. Fascinating talk. I liked when you were talking about the different cities you're going to be visiting in the near future. This was really great because by looking at those different ones, those different cities, you'll start to understand the causes, the underlying behaviours and patterns. So that we get a broader perspective. Virginia, when you were talking earlier about causes and the influences behind this, and you had talked about crime and conflict. Yeah. One of the things which has become quite one of the things which has been quite noticeable, especially in recent years, is the speed with which some of these things shift. I mean, we've seen this at our level in Britain with Brexit. There's been other really major influences. It's the concept of ideas and the speed with which ideas can move, and they can significantly influence behaviour. They can change the patterns, because we need to in handling these complex situations, we need to be able to respond really quickly. We need to understand what's happening in order to be able to cope with them. Your thoughts?
This is very much in line with what we are thinking, and actually even before this project, in the sense that both Antonio and I, we have done quite a lot of work on non-state actors and terrorists and criminals, and now also the two converge, and how groups develop hybrid identities. One of the arguments that we have been making is that the groups that become more interconnected, they become more interconnected also because it's easier for them to communicate, to exchange knowledge and to exchange ideas and to learn from one another, both in tactical terms, but also in ideological terms. So that's certainly, within our thinking. And also this issue of crime and conflict, you mentioned how the things can change and more. That's actually one piece of work that I'm very interested in, and how the interrelationship between conflict and crime. And we could argue forever, say which one causes the other. And it's very hard to find a definitive answer, because sometimes we find the crime was there before conflict, during conflict, and after conflict, and then, they're very much interlinked, and these linkages are facilitated by information technology, among other things. Thank
you. Annalisa Pires, a journalist. You have already said that you're going to concentrate on developing countries, but there are regions in which the border is becoming increasingly blurred. I'm thinking about southern Italy, where for the first time this year the prosecutors have identified a mutant form of criminality originating in Nigeria, the Black Axe Mafia. Are you going to look at this kind of overflows of criminality from African cities into Europe? Or is not part of your research at all, because you're concentrating only on developing countries?
Yes. I think that links in very neatly with the comment made by the gentleman earlier about the linkages among cities. Again, right now that's not part of the plan, but I guess we should include it.
Yeah, I mean, cities are, they have this capacity to import, as I mentioned, ideas and flows. They are hubs, and of course that these linkages are important. I think there is a true gap in the understanding of how we look at. I think the way we look at these problems of transnational organized crime is again driven by nation-state bias. So a lot of the research and a lot of the policies around those things are driven by nation-state bias. I mean, the UN has famously, embraced this issue of organized crime as being a major problem to be tackled, but by nature, the initiatives that come out of the UN are relevant, and they are conceived by and for nation states. So I think that just as there's a growing understanding of how cities can govern themselves and can have more power, more authority, and more resources to manage through their own taxation and their own legislation, I think the issue of tackling organized crime is something that will come inevitably as we begin to discuss how cities can have more autonomy in dealing with security problems. But again, at this moment, I don't think that they are doing a lot in these areas. I think it's something that is being led by the nation-state level.
Yeah, and on the organized crime piece, actually separately from the urban project, we are actually in the process of writing an Adelphi book for IISS looking at organized crime and fragility. So that will be out at some point in 2018. So I think maybe that's where we should include more of those linkages.
Yeah. Did you want to make a... No, sorry.
Well,
oh, you wanted another question?
no,
oh, okay, sorry, yeah.
So I guess the gentleman over there, and then the gentleman in the first row.
Sorry, Liam Bird from MOD. So at the beginning of your presentation, you talked a little bit about hybrid warfare. In terms of hybrid warfare, if we were to consider that through the component parts of the cyber threat, information operations and propaganda, what is your view in terms of how cities can and potentially are being used as platforms by which to generate that hybrid warfare threat? And just importantly, now and in the future, being considered as a means by which hybrid warfare can attack a city, and just importantly, how state and non-state actors in the future should be thinking about counter-hybrid warfare and how that should be addressed. What's your views on that?
Good question, yeah. I think that cities are at the core of hybrid warfare because the purpose is to use a smaller amount or a smaller resources, military and financial resources, in order to inflict great damage on your enemy. So you use proxies, you use non-state groups, you use cyber, and there's unfortunately nowhere better to do that than in cities where there is more visibility, where the media tends to concentrate. And in Ukraine, I mean, Donetsk is a very significant urban settlement in Ukraine. So, large population, large economic presence, an international airport. So I don't think it is a coincidence that we've seen a lot of activity around and in cities. However, cities are also more complex to operate. So I don't think there is a trend towards increased urban warfare because of hybrid, the trend towards hybrid conflict, more non-state groups or cyber. I think that this protracted trend, this low-intensity non-state armed group trend is something that we have to look at and find ways to make the city inherently resilient. So I think the concept of resilience is very important. So not only thinking about military assets to counter hybrid conflict, but also how to tackle issues like transportation and the flow of people and money in the city in order to facilitate the responses when an emergency, including a security emergency, happens. And of course, I mean, cyber is an important way of shielding yourself against hybrid. But in terms of the urban environment, I think that improving the inherent defenses of the system of the city in terms of its system, its functioning, I think is a more long-term strategy towards these trends.
Yes, hello. Rob Kapura from Canning House. I'm curious about how your research will look at the relationship within cities between the conflict areas, long-running conflict areas that your presentation very clearly identified as being common to many cities, and those larger parts in many cities, particularly Latin America, where people live completely normal lives and are isolated from those conflict areas, which may be one of the reasons why those areas are neglected and the conflicts run and run, because the elite, the middle classes, the decision makers, the people with money are to a large extent insulated and isolated from those conflict areas. So within the city, never mind within the nation, how are you going to look at that dichotomy?
Yeah, I think that I'll take slight issue with the question, because I think that the elites, they try to be aloof, but of course, inevitably, the effects reach them. So one of the few cities that we've conducted some pretty detailed field research was Rio de Janeiro, which is my former home city. And the pacification process that I showed, there was a balance published by the Security Secretariat in 2014 that mentioned that there was a huge drop because of this presence of security, hopefully development to some extent, could be more, but security, development, urban services in previously no-go areas or slums. Because of these pacification policies, homicides decreased by approximately 60% in slums, but in the whole of the city, it had a benefit of also reducing homicides by something around 40%. So, again, Latin America is a great case study because the initiatives towards urban security have been older. They've started some years ago or decade ago or something, because it has faced an earlier stage of urbanization. So the results are already here for us to analyze. And in Rio, we see a very clear benefit of pacifying or stabilizing these disputed territories to the broader environment. Unfortunately, there haven't been a lot of such initiatives combining this stabilization and development initiatives for us to analyze the results. But I think Latin America, there is both problems emerging from these conflict areas. It's not such a clear-cut difference, and there are clear benefits in stabilizing these areas, again, for the conflicted area and the broader city.
Okay. Thank you. Well, it looks like we've reached the end of the session. Thank you again for coming and for your input, all duly noted. And please, if you can think of anything else, get in touch with us. Again, that's our email address. And we look forward to sharing the preliminary findings and the final findings of our work in the coming months. Thank you.
Thank you very much.